here today?
Hi everyone, I'm G. For whoever is confused about what this thing is, it's actually started 2018. I was invited to be part of the show called Living Architecture. It is a show hosted in 618 North, curated by Trisha Van Eck and hosted for 50 immigrant artists and other works responding to the architecture itself. The show started with a series of studio visits, open studio in 2018 summer and opened in September 2018. And the show traveled to Michigan City in 2019 and traveled back to Chicago in Culture Center earlier this year. And the show is now in quarantine. Other works are in the building of Culture Center, but nobody can really see it. So I was originally invited to be to host the programming in the Culture Center, responding to one of my work in the show, but then this coronavirus thing hits, then everything changed. Since we have this platform, I think it's really important to use the platform to speak up for things we felt really important and timely. For my own experience, I arrived to the United States 2013, and over the years, witnessed the election of Donald Trump and the rising of political fight between China and the United States, and see how easy China bashing was being thrown out in the world, but it started with like, is that just a political fight, or is that rooted in our racism nature in this country? And Caroline, so I met Caroline last year. We started this cooperative artist round space called Justice Hotel at 618 North. So the idea is the curators are work together with the artists and sharing the profits, and the art space itself generates the profits through. So the whole project is we turned 618 North into a hotel, and the hotel rooms are actually funding for our art programs, and all our art programs are giving platform to people who are working in different areas concerning justice topics. So I met Caroline through that way, and it's super interesting to see her perspective. She works a lot with labor issues in Asian American communities, and it's really refreshing to see her take on to counter this model minority narrative, and to really dig into the history and to find out what the reality is. And the result is really alarming, and I think everyone should know. And it's really important for us, especially for this time, to find a way to communicate to each other, also to find a way to organizing and to prepare to move forward, because the new situation can be an opportunity, and we should use this opportunity to, because everyone's awareness of the inequity is so high, and everyone's are quarantined, but their mind is not quarantined. Let's use the energy and let's find out what should we do to move forward. So for today's programming, I think Caroline gonna take about 40 minutes to run through a presentation about Chinatown and their American imaginary. And after that, we're gonna have an open conversation. hopefully, if we can manage to this through Zoom. So one thing I really love through our last year's experience in Justice Hotel at 618 North is before all the shows, we all invite everyone attending to introduce themselves. So to have a real sense of who is here and who we are, and so we can know each other since we are in this community together. So I want to, if anyone willing, to keep the tradition here.
I'm going to unmute everyone so that you can introduce yourselves. It's going to be a little bit confusing, but we'll try to do maybe hand raise, or if you don't want to share your video, you can just, or maybe we call on people. So in order of people who arrive first. So Caroline, 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 you're presenting, but you haven't said who you are yet.
I'm Caroline. Yes, I worked with Trisha and G on the Justice Hotel project, so I'm going to be sharing for this discussion today. Yes.
Abby?
Yes, hi, my name is Abby Eusebio, and I literally just a couple hours ago randomly saw the invite on Facebook, and it definitely interested me because I actually serve as a community outreach liaison for Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul, and we are actively trying to address the issue of the anti-Asian discrimination and bigotry, and currently have our Civil Rights Bureau taking hate crime reports online and via phone, and we're working on beefing up our translation services. So there's more work to be done. We're working with some other offices on trying to do more outreach. So this definitely is a great opportunity to learn more from the community.
Great, thank you. Next, Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay, and I'm here because I think that it is important as a white American to hear from the perspectives of people so I can be a better ally. I also spent 2 years working in China, and that can, that puts you sometimes as a white American working in China when you return into a very interesting area of getting very strange questions from other white Americans. So getting just more of a grasp on how to address xenophobia and be a better ally.
Thank you. Sanji? We'll go down to Ada. And sorry if I'm mispronouncing names. Ada?
Ada, that's totally fine. Ada. How are you? Hi, everyone. Ada Jen here. So good to see some of you. I participated in 6018 North activities before, performed a couple of times, and really enjoyed the event. And I have participated in these type of conversations, quite a few of them. I'm interested in seeing what people have to say and learn more about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, I just have visited the Chicago Cultural Center and, you know, followed them on Facebook and saw this event and thought it sounded interesting.
Thank you. Lee?
Hi, I went to school with Caroline, so I'm support her, but also my roommate, who is half Chinese, had a recent experience where she was going to ride the red line and she was trying to make sure she was safe and wanting to make sure people didn't know she was Chinese because she was scared about what was going to happen when she was on a public transit. For me, I just want to figure out how I can just figure out how I can support and what's going on from everyone's different perspectives. So.
Thank you. Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin. Well, there's two of us in your screen.
I'm Jill Stone.
And we live with G. So
Yeah.
of course we have to show up and support, but we also wanted to. I think it's a very important conversation, and it's good to have a shared experience of like, here's some shared knowledge, and now we can talk about it. So I like the organization of this event.
Nalani, thank you. Nalani?
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here because I like all the programming at 6018, and I'm really happy to have a presentation and a discussion locally based on Asian American experiences in and around, you know, this space. Thanks.
Thank you. The drawing room?
Hi, this is actually Winnie. I forgot to fix my screen name. I'm a friend of Caroline's, and also hello to Dean. Looking forward to your presentation. I'm particularly interested in, I'm currently doing research around outsiders and insiders. And I think this, what we experience right now, being born and raised from Hong Kong, I think is not only the coronavirus, but there's a lot of link to the historical context and also a projection to the future as well. So looking forward to your sharing.
Thank you. Vero?
Yeah, sorry I'm late. What was?
Oh, we're just asking you to introduce yourself briefly and why you came.
Oh, okay, thank you. So my name is Vero. I'm really interested in the concept of otherness, and I haven't seen a lot of discussion. I mean, I've seen people want to talk about this, but not in depth, and so I'm just kind of curious of what will be said.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing people's names. Vivian?
Hi, yes, that is correct. Hi, I'm Vivian. I work for Coalition for a Better Chinese American Community, and we're trying to figure out how to have these conversations, especially with like older community members as well as younger community members. So yeah, thank you for organizing this, everyone.
Thank you. Aiko?
Yes, hi. I'm just really happy to be here and be able to talk about these things in a group, and also to hear Caroline and G's take on what's going on. And yeah, just I do believe that this is an important thing to be thinking about as a community and as a group. So yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Anna?
Hi, I'm just here to listen and like learn how I can like support people, I guess.
Great, thank you. Angela?
Hi, my name's Angela Lynn, and I am one of the co-founders of an organization called People Matter, and we work in 7 neighborhoods, one of which is Chinatown. There's also Bridgeport, Armour Square, sort of McKinley Park, sort of the area where there are a lot of Chinese immigrants. Sorry. Someone else. Yeah, so, you know, we're like working with the community on these issues. Like we had a call to, and so just really concerned about, you know, Chinatown, this area, and all the anti-Chinese and anti-East Asian sentiment. So yeah, just here to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Cherry? We'll come back to Cherry. We skipped Sanjay. Sanjay? Let's go to Doreen.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from Hong Kong. I'm born and raised in Hong Kong, and I come here for school for SAIC, and I study art education. And actually, I know Caroline because she is the curator of our show, like our Hong Kong show in the school.
Okay, thank you, Gianella. Gianella, I think you just entered. We're asking people who joined just to briefly introduce yourself and why you came. Okay, we'll go to, let's see. Eleanor?
Hi, yeah. I've really admired Caroline's work for a long time, and I think I had an experience, a few experiences at the Justice Hotel programming that were just like really meaningful and resonated heavily with some of the discourse that I've experienced, especially in regards to topics around Chinatown in Toronto, where I did my master's program. And so this just feels like a really important conversation, both in this current moment, but also is such a resonant space within, you know, topics of gentrification and assimilation and segregation. And I'm just really grateful for the conversation to be happening in this context and for it to be such an ongoing thing that people are putting a lot of energy into. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ellie?
Hi, I'm Ellie. I was based in Chicago before, but I'm now in LA. I'm pretty interested in, I guess, the wave of xenophobic racism against both Chinese people, but also African migrants, for example, in Guangzhou. And I wonder if there are moments for transnational solidarity based on sort of kind of a broader critique of global capitalism and also the surveillance and policing infrastructures that come with those violences.
Thank you. Abel? So we'll go to Jordan. If you could unmute yourself and explain why you introduce yourself and why you came. Or I'll just keep on. Yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, so I just wanted to find out more about what's going on and the impact on people here, more than what I just heard about in the news. So I don't really know much about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Percy?
Hi, I came because I just want to support Caroline, if that's not too straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you. Kwang Mok?
Hi, my name is Kyungmook, and I participated in Justice Hotel last year, and that's how I got to know this place and exhibition. And I particularly interested in like the situation of like racism and xenophobia within this situation of like COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm looking forward to hearing about Caroline's talk.
Thank you. SY?
Hi, my name is SY, and I did programming at a hotel last year, and I'm here to listen.
Thank you. I think, is there anyone else who hasn't spoken that I've missed? I think there's a few people, but speak now and then we'll start. I mean, not that we haven't started, but thank you all for joining. And it's so great that we can all, in the midst of this disturbing time, we can come together and actually work together, like G said, and find ways of transforming a horrible time, a difficult time, into something that is a kind of solace and solidarity. So thank you all. Caroline, do you want to start?
Yeah,
I'm going to
I'd
mute
love to.
everyone else.
Okay. So thank you guys so much for coming. It's really great to hear a little bit about all of the reasons that you were interested in being a part of this conversation. I had many conversations with Trisha and G before this around this topic. I'm a transplant from Brooklyn, New York, so that will be a lot of the framing that I use. Since Chicago is still relatively new to me, I moved here 3 years ago. But I think a lot of the issues that are coming up now that affect the Chinese community and the Asian community as a result are obviously not unique entirely to us, and the experiences are part of a greater American experience. And so it was really wonderful to have this opportunity with this show of immigrants to talk about some of the issues that have been coming up, particularly in a new way, maybe more urgently than it has seemed before in the mainstream conversation. So some of the things that we're just going to touch on, it is a very, I think, big topic, and there's not really a lot of opportunity for nuance in the media points, I think, often, and that's what so many of us find frustrating. So we're going to try to unpack a lot of those things and think about not so much presenting solutions, right, but really how to have those conversations. What is a way to make them more meaningful? What is a way that we can start to look into what's beneath the surface for ourselves and for the people around us? And some of the things that we'll kind of blaze through that I think are important in understanding what's going on is, one is the role of aesthetics in shaping perspective. How they have reinforced historical imperial ideologies, and this continual erasure of history and narratives of resistance, solidarity, and agency that I think are important in doing the thing that everybody wants, which is to move forward and have a little bit of depth to something that is hard to find resources for, unfortunately. The main point that I want to begin with is that even though this is news now, it's not new. And the violence, the anti-Asianness, which are at the forefront of the conversation now, is not the first time it has happened. And the sentiments are very deeply embedded in our society and culture. And I think it's important to understand it that way, and just kind of situate ourselves where we are and how we frame this issue, and to look a little more deeply at the roots of it and the impact. And where I think, because of that, I would like to start is with a particular case. In 2015, there was a case in New York with NYPD officer Peter Liang. He was a rookie cop who was patrolling a high-rise in the projects in Brooklyn, and he pulled out his gun. It was a dimly lit stairwell. Heard a sound, fired it off. The bullet ricocheted off the wall, and it killed Akai Gurley, a 20-year-old father who lived in the building. He bled to death, and the media reports came out saying that the two officers, they were so consumed with making that mistake, they were on the phone trying to call their union reps instead of finding aid for the victim, and it led to manslaughter charges and a conviction of Peter Liang, which was very rare. This was at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it resulted in 15,000 members of the Chinese community coming out to protest this conviction. So it was a very unique kind of in the eyes of the city, I think. This doesn't really happen. It was very unexpected. And there were protests on both sides of the conviction. And so I thought that would be an important place to start, because when we talk about any issues of race in the United States, I think it is important to kind of frame it in the context of race in the United States. And I think this is something that is an important part of how we understand where the trajectory has come from and where we can go with it. So I'm gonna start with this video. Christopher Kwok is an attorney working with the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in New York. And this is just a clip of some footage from a conversation that took place in February of 2015.
Talk about white cops in New York City that get away with it, and the DAs in Staten Island that let them get away with it. And what are you guys doing about that? About Dan Donovan?
But that's where we've always been, sir.
Have you?
We've always
What have you guys been doing about Dan Donovan?
We've been always.
What have you been doing about Dan Donovan?
Black people ran their own candidate, James Lane.
You got beat.
Right.
You got beat
but
like a drum.
Asians didn't support him.
So we can't.
Did the Asian community support it?
We can't protest now because of that.
The Asian community is protesting today based on misinformation of the facts.
Okay. Given the facts that have happened in the previous shooting,
that's the argument. White cops have not been indicted.
No.
Peter Liang should not be indicted.
Let me make the next step. Let me make the next argument, which is that if you want to change the state of the law, you don't change it on the backs of an Asian American.
Okay. Let's go.
So we can't.
The Asian community is of the facts.
Okay.
Have not been.
Make the next step. Let me make the next argument, which is that if you want to change the state of the law, you don't change it on the backs of an Asian American cop. You change the state of the law for all cops.
So
that's the argument.
That's the argument. Should not have been indicted until a white cop is indicted.
You should have faced a system that's going to be applied equally to all that come forward. That's my argument.
So
I don't want to take it any further than you have said.
At the end of the day, if it's not your people, you do not care.
That's true. It happens a lot,
and that's what needs to stop.
I oppose that, and I agree with you.
That's what needs to stop.
But at the same time, you should not accept the scapegoat.
We do not ignore problems.
You do. Let's not paint too good of a picture. I agree. Look, let me agree with you that more Asian Americans should be there with the black community against police violence. Let me agree with you on the board. Okay. But at the same time, African Americans are not there for us and have our backs on every issue. That is not the case. Let's not.
There's definitely lots of division in society. I wouldn't argue with you.
I'm just saying. I mean, I'm admitting the sins of the community as much as I can. Right. But let's talk about it real. The overall issue is white supremacy in this country, in our institutions, that allow these prosecutions selectively to go forward and to be done on political grounds. Asian Americans in New York City do not have political power to the extent that Staten Island white people do under Dan Donovan, and that African Americans do under Ken Thompson in Brooklyn. And so that's what they're frustrated about. You know what?
The same people.
I agree with you that there's a lot that needs to be flattened out, and I want to work with you. Can I have your name or number, and we can talk more?
You're more than welcome to do that.
And I want to actually do a panel for the Asian American community, and I want you to come, and I want us to talk about it. and have a really heart-to-heart or difficult discussion, because I don't want to do it like this is ridiculous, right? We're yelling at each other across the street, and that's why I came over to talk to you, and I've learned a lot from you, and I'm gonna like think more and talk about it. I don't want to do it more, but I'm not.
Some nuances, and I think it illustrates some common frustrations in moving the conversation about social justice forward where the Asian American community is concerned. And so that's something that I think is important to unpack as we go through this together. And before we move forward in this conversation, therefore, I think it's important to go back and to build a kind of foundational framework to work from that we can have a kind of common understanding of where some of these things have come from, and to address what I think is a critical lack of information, understanding, and context, not just about Asians in America, but also amongst Asian Americans as well. So I wanted to go through some historical trajectory. So where I'm going to start is basically when mass migration to the US started of Asians. And this started with in the mid 1800s from China. And this was a group that was almost exclusively from a very small region in southern China, from Canton, and specifically from Toisan. And this happened in relation to a lot of political situations that was happening in China and in the US. So China has just, is in a very bad state. They have almost been colonized by the British and the French, and with participation from the US. There is like a lot of famine in the region. They've had a lot of challenges. And in the US, this is right after the United States have lost a lot of their cheap labor after the emancipation of their enslaved Black population. And this combined with the expanding frontier in the West, the gold rush, railway construction, and building out all of the land in California and the whole region. So the need for replaceable, disposable, cheap labor really encouraged this. And I think it's important to also look at and recognize the differences in the conversation about indentured servitude and European migration, with the differences that are presented with the population of Chinese migrants and laborers that came, where they are overseen by the white superiors in all of those situations. And in this context, you have the formation of the first Chinatowns. And these ghettos are also unique in that they are a result of exclusion, and they have created a continuation of the isolation of the Chinatowns. And it started with this kind of specific context where Chinese workers were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods. They faced intense discrimination, and the men were not allowed to bring families. They were not allowed to marry. There were very, very few women were allowed into the US. Most of them had to work on contract as prostitutes were sold into prostitution as well. And so therefore the men did not have a pathway or an incentive to integrate or assimilate into US society. And so these Chinatowns were where they were forced to live. And so it really had this history
of development in a very insular way. And there are 3 dates that I think stand out significantly that in the history of these first Chinatowns in the West Coast. We have 1871. There's a huge massacre in Los Angeles, Chinatown. A mob of about 500 white and mestizo persons entered Chinatown. It was a very violent attack. They pillaged homes and shops, and people were dragged into the street. They were lynched, either shot or hanged. And the massacre took place on what is known as Calle de los Negros, also Negro Alley. And it was so serious that it actually took the front page news away from the Chicago fire for a day. 1882 was when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and it has the distinction of being the only federal law in history to ever exclude a group of people based on nationality, and remains so to this day. And it didn't end until 1943 with World War II, when the US depended upon China's allyship against the Japanese Empire. 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and the burning of Chinatown. So there are a lot of fires that occurred during that time, and the fire departments at that time used 2 methods to put out the fires, ignited by the earthquake, the water, and dynamite. And the wealthy white neighborhood nearby, they got the precious water, and Chinatown got the dynamite. And it didn't also really work that well. But the idea is to explode the building so the fire would stop. So this disseminated Chinatown, and the real estate is like very precious. So they had plans to take it over. But a group of Chinese business owners strategically found a way to rebuild San Francisco Chinatown, and they cooperated with a white architect and white engineer who had never been to China to rebuild Chinatown, rebranding it from this idea of it being a slum of foreigners, opium dens and prostitutes and all of that, to this exotic wonderland, and basically started a PR campaign of aesthetic appeal to attract tourists. And it was very successful. It was so successful that it has been replicated to this day. So all of these pagodas, these like religious imagery is very unique to US Chinatowns. And this use of aesthetics to create this Oriental fantasy was useful because it redirected whites from fear in Chinatown to seeking Chinatown pleasures. And this has created an outsized legacy of aesthetics, the role of aesthetics in the place that Chinese people have in America. And this reliance on aesthetics to resolve issues of racism and it is in a lot of ways a response to its use and its weaponization. And it has done a great deal and has a really huge part in shaping the American imaginary. And so on the other side of this, we see this that was concurrently happening from the government. Presentations of Chinese as subhumans or deformed Europeans.
6018 North.
And
they're hosting a...
And I think this imagery is important to understand the consistent narrative of the Chinamen, that they are a tricky, mystical race. We have no idea what they're up to. This perpetual Oriental caricature is used to justify political goals. And it has been a critical access point for American perception and attitudes about the Chinese and subsequently all Asians in America. It's been used in a lot of propagandistic agendas. And this type of subhuman depiction has persisted in American representations of Asian people in a way that's completely normalized. We don't even notice it. I will say that I grew up with all of these imagery, and you don't really think about it because that is almost exclusively what you have access to. This normalization continues even to contemporary times. This is a interesting recent video, I think it's from 2015, featured on the Elite Daily. It was thousands of views on Facebook. And the tagline is something everyone can relate to. And it has these roommates who are arguing about who ate the leftovers. The Chinese delivery guy shows up with more leftovers, or more Chinese food rather. And one of the roommates brings him in. He's so excited to have people pay attention to him. He's so overwhelmed that he commits seppuku and he slices himself open in gratitude, offering himself to his new friends. And inside his body is Chinese takeout, which his new friends can now eat. And the responses to the video were, and you can look it up to this day, or just, this is hilarious. This is, this is a very important thing to understand, I think, that until I would say the last couple of years, this is the only, the main, if not only, representation of Asian people in the popular imagination in the United States. Even as an exercise, if you consider all the media imagery, Hollywood productions with Asian cultural storylines, Asian American celebrities, it is exclusive to this kind of perception, subhuman clownish caricatures, and specifically around Asian American males. And this history of diminishing the people and normalizing dehumanization is also in tandem with this whitewashing and co-opting of cultural imagery. And it is this fantastical historical fetishization, this mystical, mysterious East, and used as a backdrop of Eurocentric fantasies and adventure. There's this use of Asian people and culture as an exotic background for white-centric adventure. And the culture being extracted and the people erased or degraded has a lot to do with not just the imaginary of Americans about Asians, but even for Asian Americans about themselves. And so I think what was interesting to me, and where G and I and Trisha started talking about this conversation, was originally about this phenomenon that I think of, this transference of these imperial ideologies to our food culture. We live now in a period of extreme experiential consumerism, and this evolution to our media consumption into experiential consumption due to globalization and the expansion of digital and social media, has meant a lot of things for diversity and inclusion. But in a lot of ways, they are not erasing these ideologies, but extending it. And something that has been very popular in contemporary media is food shows. I think this growing popularity of food consumption, it functions both as entertainment and as social signaling. And we have three main varieties: instructional videos, food competition, and most recently there's been an explosion of food adventuring. And Bell Hooks calls these aspirations and sensibilities a part of the disease of neoliberal mechanics. She locates mass culture as the place that both publicly declares and perpetuates the idea that there's pleasure to be found in the acknowledgement and enjoyment of racial difference. And it is an idea that necessitates a perpetual difference between races, and it has found its legs in the digital age of social media. And this also, I think, has been a really interesting phenomenon to watch expand. The commodification of an essential life resource and the ephemeral sensations that are associated with it and the joy that's derived from it is also co-opted. The eating behaviors, the methods and knowledge around cooking that are intertwined with food are also geographically, culturally, and socioeconomically specific. They are also commodified. So one of the interesting things about this is how much it relies on difference. There's the term that she uses called cultural anhedonia, which describes the sense of numbness and inability to feel pleasure as a result of the constant stimuli that we now experience in our culture. And in this situation, difference is seductive precisely because the mainstream imposition of sameness is a provocation that terrorizes. And so one of the things that we see is this evolution of imperialist nostalgia into our food culture. This is Andrew Zimmern, who is famous for Bizarre Foods and his whole Bizarre Foods series. And he opened up this restaurant a couple of years ago called Lucky Cricket. And he said in his promo that he is saving the souls of all the people from having to dine at these horseshit restaurants masquerading as Chinese food that are in the Midwest. So managed to insult all Midwesterners, all Chinese restaurants in the Midwest. Part of this like aestheticization of ethnic eating is very evident in this attitude. This example that he says is going to save everybody from fake Chinese food is a mishmash of Orientalist tropes itself, including a tiki bar. And Gordon Ramsay in that same year opened up Lucky Cat, and he called it a vibrant Asian eating house. My colleague and head chef of Lucky Cat, Ben Orfwood, is way more qualified and experienced than me in this field. He's done the research, having traveled back and forth to South Asia for many months. So a lot like the practice of leisure slumming during the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, where the ruling class would go on excursions to the slums for an adventure to see how the other half lived and to spice up their lives and show how edgy they are. This has been an interesting way to look at these reoccurring attitudes in our food culture today. The practice of culinary slumming, which provides a relatively comfortable means for middle-class whites to negotiate the racial complexities of our era. And it's emerged as a central feature in this construction of a kind of post-racial positionality. In this case, for example, journalist Elaine Hui, she's a Chinese British, and she was the only East Asian to attend the event, and she wrote about it on Eater and expressed her disappointment and discomfort. She called the experience culturally insensitive and tone deaf, and she was torn apart by Gordon Ramsay for it. So it's an interesting understanding the value of this kind of voyeurism of the social and symbolic practice around diversity and diverse eating, therefore, and how it's used to articulate racial difference in food, tourism, television, and in this kind of emergent form of privileged cosmopolitanism that enacts the aspirations of neoliberal globalism. What it also does, I think, that's important to think about is that it really puts a lot of pressure on the ethnic communities that are representing these ideas. The pursuit of authenticity itself requires that culture remains unadulterated by change, which is really counter to what culture actually is. Culture is how people live. And it will change based on geography, on time, on resources, things like that. And so when the pinnacle of cultural worth is your authenticity, then it creates a number of problems. One, the consumer is then the one who determines the value of your culture. And two, it really limits the ability for an ethnic community to speak for itself. And on top of this unwavering hunt for authenticity, the dirtiest taco spot, the most authentic noodle place. It emphasizes this imagined idea of the one place and time that a group of people have existed and where that culture comes from. And any deviation from it is then slowly erased and absorbed into the pre-existing culture or Americanized. And that brings us to also, I think, some of the challenges today in the Asian American response to Andrew Yang. And I think that he has been a complicated figure in this time. He was, I think, accused of using a lot of tired stereotypes of Asian Americans in order to cater to a wider range of voters. And recently, he tried to kind of address the challenges of the anti-Asian racism that has been happening with kind of an appeal to respectability politics, which is an idea that really picked up momentum in the 1990s to urge Black Americans to dress or behave in a certain way in order to neutralize racism. And this idea is that in order to receive better treatment from the group in power, you have to just behave better. Doesn't really work. But beyond that, I think it's important to look at this idea of why it's so popular and why it's so popular to a lot of Asian Americans and why it can be really convincing. And it has its root in this history, I think. Jeff Chang, in one of his pieces, since the late 1960s, pundits have regularly trotted out the supposed economic and social success of Asian Americans to neutralize Black and Latino and even other Asian American claims of racial discrimination. And I think what is most important about the fallacy of this model minority narrative is that it isn't true. If we look at the actual data, Asian Americans, in fact, lag well behind whites in wealth and household per capita income. I think a lot of the statistics that are looked at also don't really take into account the differences in the Asian American community. So one of the ways I think would be helpful to kind of look at it, that for me is most striking about looking at images like this, is that it's very different from my own experience growing up. So I think I wanted to kind of take a look at what an experience actually is like. And I think not only the lack of access to the history of the Asian American community in the US is been very powerful in fueling anti-Asian sentiment and misunderstanding. But also this inaccessibility due to the isolation of Chinese and Asian American communities. So one thing that I think is useful to think about and to understand, not only is that the Asian American community is not one giant community, but even in New York City, Chinatown, which is what I'm going to be speaking about because that's my hometown. There is a really important distinction that Professor Peter Kwong, who was one of the foremost scholars on Chinatown before he passed, I think in 2017, is what he calls the uptown Chinese versus the downtown Chinese. The uptown Chinese are educated in Western studies. They are able to make a living independent of Chinatown. They are able to move easily and socially in the American world. And they are mostly, they come here as immigrants with degrees already from families that are scholars, professors, professionals before immigrating. The downtown Chinese are different in that the downtown Chinese of New York are confined to Lower Manhattan's Chinatown borders. And the strong, very popular narrative of the Tiger Mom, where only grades matter, go to Harvard, and play 3 instruments. The reality does not exist for a really large group of the population. I have no relation to that world at all. 54% of the Chinese in New York City do not speak English well or at all, and 71% have not finished high school. The Asian population is still only about 2% of the US population. And I think that is a very big part of the power of media representation, is that most Americans have not actually spent time with Asian people. And so the power of the images that are available has an outsized role in determining what kind of ideas about Asian communities exist. This is an image, it's very typical for all of my Chinese New Yorkers, of a typical Chinese American family, there is about 73% of the adult US Asian population that is born outside of the US, compared to, for example, 48% of the Hispanic population. And what that also means is that most Asians in the US do not have a strong concept of US history. And that includes the history of racism and the challenges of past generations of Asians, as well as of Blacks and Hispanics. And the fact that there's an overwhelming percentage of first-generation Asians really affects the entire conversation that we are able to have as a community about not just racism, but about politics, about history, and about solidarity. So I think that is a really critical piece of understanding that needs to be taken into account when we reach for cross-racial solidarity efforts, because it's almost like it has been engineered, this constant reset and this continual set of immigrants who come and really strive and do anything that they can and want to participate in the American dream. So if we look at real narratives from the Chinatown community, it is like a very different experience from the images that you see. This image on the left is taken from Hong Kong in the 60s. That's where, very similar to where my parents lived, grew up before they came to the US in the 70s. They met in New York. The picture on the right is a typical tenement apartment in Chinatown. The children are in a tub next to the sink, and the sink that you see there is not a bathroom sink, it's a kitchen sink. And this is the setup for a lot of the apartments that we grow up in, our grandparents live in when we first moved to the States. So it's not at all this go to Harvard narrative. Everyone comes mostly with very little education, very little ability, if at all, in English, very little opportunity. And there's that double isolation, not just of discrimination from the outside, but not being able to navigate outside of Chinatown. And that connection, growing up in the US as a first generation American in those communities also makes it very difficult not just to connect as an American, but with your own family. And one of the only memories I remember growing up in New York, being very proud of being Chinese and happy about it, was of Chinese New Year. The celebrations in Chinatown were really big, exciting. When I was growing up, we still had firecrackers everywhere. The whole Chinatown would smell like gunpowder. That is not allowed anymore. But this was, I think, a very important experience that wasn't possible in other contexts. And I think seeing a way for a second generation of Americans to find a way, in spite of language barriers, in spite of educational differences, in spite of having no context for what your parents are going through and them not having anything to be able to offer to help you to navigate around you, to be able to create an identity that you can be proud of. That is not just this deformed European sense of self, where you are able to recreate for yourself something that is you, that is Asian and is American. And these traditions, for example, of the lion dance, painstaking craft, when they are co-opted, it does make it very, very different to see, to understand why. This is not in New York. I think this was in Sydney. They are now family friendly. It really has a big impact, I think, on your ability to see yourself understood and connected and integrated in any way. And what is lost also, I think, is a long history of political engagement of the Chinese in America. All of the protests that happen, all of the attempts that are made, if they are not successful, they did not exist. They are a failure. They are erased. And part of the erasure is a lot of times due to what I mentioned as like the double isolation. These popular images from the 1960s of the attempts from the Asian Americans and Black and Latino Americans and Rainbow Coalition, they are not a continuous, uninterrupted lineage, but they do resurface naturally. There have been coalitions that continually are erased from the American collective memory, both from then and from now. These are also from Chinatown, 1990s, 2005. There was a very popular chicken game and arcade games there. It was torn down, I think, in 2015. And even arts collectives, where it now is a very different experience because of that consistent erasure. And then I want to touch briefly on what happens with place. I think in Chicago, we see a lot of it. We talk about a lot what's happening in Pilsen, in Brownsville, in Logan Square, all of these neighborhoods, Humboldt Park, that are gentrifying and creating erasure. Part of that, I think, is very important to understand, has to do with this consistent evolution of imperial ideology. In New York City, Chinatown, in the past 2 years, this came out in 2016, 40 art galleries moved into Chinatown. In the 6 blocks surrounding Mott Street, 91 galleries now exist, 60% open in the last 3 years. And this is very important, as I think in Chicago we can understand, because 80% of residents in Chinatown are renters. And I think this process of utilizing this romantic, ethnic, urban environment as, again, a way to adventure and to co-op and experience is a big part of what continues this erasure in the narrative and also in very real physical ways. Fergus O'Sullivan in City Lab did this article about the process of art washing, which transforms urban blight into something suitable for real estate developers. And in an affected community, neglected properties with long-term residents are turned into short-term residencies for artist communities and students, which are proxies for corporate interests, flaunted as a kind of reinvigoration to the neighborhood. And then these artists become part of this cleansing and treated by developers as a form of regenerative detergent on the way to wealthier markets. One example of this that happened quite recently, I believe 2015 or 2016, this used to be a very busy convenience store in Chinatown. The shop was evicted and a gallery was opened. And this is the James Cohen Gallery. This installation by Omar Fast, the artist, is very interesting because not only did the gallery take the space over from this small grocery mart, the artist then dressed the exterior and the interior to imitate a Chinese business as an artwork. And as you can see, the depiction of this Chinese business, it focuses on the aesthetics of dilapidation as culture. It doesn't feature any real actual business or anything even actually Chinese. It's just the artist's idea of a Chinese business. And he said it is very sad that people thought it was racist. This is the inside of his said business, where there's a reconstructed half-finished hallway, garbage, and trash, nondescript waiting room. This is part of this continuation of an imaginary. So beyond ethnic communities being vulnerable, they also are made into a really essential element in this art washing process, where the history and selective nostalgia and the very carefully sprinkled grit create this product of urban life, and also allows everyone to avoid the responsibility to those displaced. And this really requires this idea of people as aesthetics and exoticization of ethnic culture. And in response, the community has come out to deal with this, but it hasn't done anything in the way that takes notice, that any mainstream media or developers take notice. Even the patrons how were seen pushing patrons aside, protesters aside and fighting with them. When the community tried to have a meeting, all the galleries surrounding were invited. None of the galleries attended. And so what I think we can do as we kind of evaluate these different facets of what's going on. I know this is not a kind of neat linear presentation, and more just trying to look at what all of the pieces are that we can try to make sense of, that I think are important. If we are to move forward, I think it's very clear that it will have to be something that we do together. And one question that I think remains, which I think someone mentioned earlier, when we talk about anti-Asian racism or Asians participating in racism, understanding ourselves and understanding each other, there is, I think, this important question that is not really answerable, but I think is very definitive of where we are. These kinds of situations that present to us between the Black community and the Asian community, I think we do need to lean into them on both sides. This, for example, came out a couple of years ago. Jeremy Lin had dreads, and Kenya Martins was ridiculing him for it. And the language that he uses fair, perhaps, his critique or concern about the sensitivities around the politics of Black hair were very much in line with the kinds of ideologies that maintain this difference. And I think Jeremy Lin's response was measured, but I think if you looked into the comment section, there was a very easy devolution of the conversation into anti-Black rhetoric that happened almost immediately. So this is a very complicated thing for us to move forward with. We have popular cultural visuals and phenomena like now renamed Rich Brian. He has since apologized for his foolishness. But as easy as it is to identify the appropriation and issues with this kind of behavior, this isn't unique to just co-opting of Black culture. And this cross-fetishization is also something that I think has a lot of room for us to understand. I think it's not something that we'll go into today. It's a whole other conversation. But I think it does encourage us to look outside of the racial binary. This is from one of Gary Okahiro's essays. I think binaries are simple-minded ways of categorizing not just people, but also things, objects other than oneself. Binaries provide a kind of coherence. They allow for a simple and straightforward explanation of who one is and who one is not. And so this binary of who one is, which is whiteness, and who one is not, which is Blackness, in this case affords a kind of self-definition and also a privilege that authorizes one to define the other. This binary invention has allowed an elasticity to the new world version of an old world caste system in which the ruling class, here white, is able to expand and contract its ranks as its needs change. And it has included and excluded different peoples at different times. And Asians, like other racialized minorities who are distinguished by color and by face, pose a problem to this binary by not fitting. So if you cannot assimilate, you are a problem. And having this unfixable problem that those with an Asian face who are forever unassimilatable. This is something that cannot be addressed in the racial binary and in stuff like behavioral respectability politics. So it really challenges us to go a little bit deeper than that. So that said, coming back to these conversations that I hope that we are able to begin. I obviously don't have any answers, but hopefully I think this can provide kind of a point of dialogue that includes more than just the obvious. There is a lot of work, even just to understand where we are right now, that I think we'll have to do together. All I have been able to share today is one perspective, and I know that there are many here today. So this is the end of what I'm going to share today. But I wanted to allow us to just go back to where we began with understanding our own selves and kind of giving the benefit of the doubt to others. I wanted to end with this image. Just, I think, is a very poignant kind of representation of looking from the inside versus looking from the outside. I think it's very easy to see this as something that's like dirty, gross, messy, plastic bags, the walls, you know, everywhere. But I think if you see it as someone from inside the community, it's very clear, clearly represents a picture of a home. Someone is making dinner. It's very tidy. There's a lot of resourcefulness there, even without cabinets, of how the belongings are organized and kept. There's a pretty lady calendar for a decoration, and there is, you know, an open window to let the light in. I think that is a very important way for us to approach one another in this kind of a situation, to reach in for that kind of a reading, and to begin the conversation at that point. So I'm gonna give this back to G. He's gonna, I think, if anybody has any questions that you wanna just kind of type in, just so that we can maybe talk about it, that might be a more organized way.
Thank you, Caroline.
Oops.
I think it's really important to think about like who controls their narrative and who has a platform for the narrative. It is like even within the Chinese community, there's I think 6 to 7 newspapers. 2 is from Taiwan, 2 is from the mainland China, and 1 is Falun Gong, and all of them have a particular political motive outside the United States. And those are the medias are presenting the narrative, and which is not focusing on people's life, mostly living in the community here. Another, I think in Peter Kwong's research, he proposed a question talking about why the Chinese community come here as minors, as slave laborers, and why suddenly the community becoming a wealthy community. He pointed out the time when the immigration ban was being lifted. I think it's about like around the 1970s, when most of the immigrants coming to the United States are actually wealthy and well-connected. Chinese who come here to on or H-1B visa, working in upper middle class status, and they're contributing to this kind of disconnecting to like even within the community. And you pointed out 70% of the Asian American community members are born outside the United States. So like it's really difficult to have to even find a common ground, or if the common ground was established there already. Could you talk more about the Peter Lam protesting, and based on your own knowledge, because like that happens in your own community, like what kind of group stand out for what cause, and how the general community responding to the incident?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only speak from my personal perspective, but it definitely is not as cohesive as it appears. There are 3 main Chinatowns in New York at the moment. The oldest one in Lower Manhattan, which is mainly Cantonese speaking. The one in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which is mainly Fujianese speaking. And then the one in Flushing, Queens, which is mainly Taiwanese and Mandarin speaking. So nobody even speaks the same language. They are all mutually incomprehensible dialects from people who have very different backgrounds, political backgrounds. The members of the community from Taiwan come from a very different reality they bring with them than, say, the laborers from Fujian. And so that's one. But also, there's a very big distinction between those who are, I think, uptown. I'm just going to keep using those phrases because I think that they're useful. Uptown Chinese versus downtown Chinese. I grew up in a downtown Chinese community, and that is my culture, and that is how I identify. But I am now an uptown Chinese. I have postgraduate education. I speak English. I was educated in private universities. And I have access to opportunities and knowledge and resources and a privilege to have a different way of defending myself. The video footage that you saw is from an old friend who grew up in the same neighborhood as I did. And he's a cinematographer, but he just went because he now lives nearby to see what was going on. He is also a Brooklyn boy, but he's also Chinese American. He also grew up in the projects. He also has family members in the NYPD. So it's very complicated, actually. And the frustration is in being certain that you are not heard, that anything can happen to you, no one will do anything or not necessarily even hear you. That is a very major part of the experience, I think. But that also perpetuates the kind of self-silencing where the community doesn't really participate politically, not just for what happens to Black people or to other people, but even for themselves. It is very rare that this kind of rallying point comes up, and that's why it was so unique. And I think the kinds of experiences that occur in a very small place like these neighborhoods in New York that are very concentrated with people from very different backgrounds, it creates a lot of opportunities for conversation if we know how to find them, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of inaccessibility to cross those community lines as well. So I think that that's something that those of us who are able to reach across to try, I think it really is on us to do. So Christopher Kwong, who you saw speak in that video, he made that attempt, but he is not the majority of the Chinese community in New York, as I mentioned. He uniquely, for someone his age, speaks English without an accent, which is rare because, like you mentioned, immigration for Asians to the US didn't open up until after 1965 and didn't really open up until the 1970s. So most Asians that you meet they will not have that ability to navigate those kinds of cross-cultural relationships. And so it really will depend on us to do that for ourselves, I think.
Someone in the audience asked, could you talk about your view on how internalized racial binary or the in-betweenness might have contributed to the erasure you talked about in this presentation?
I will try. I think for me, this has been a very long journey. This material I have been really trying very hard to find for myself for many years. I think we all know that you don't learn about this in school. So the general American public does not learn about this in school, but that also means that Asians growing in America do not learn about themselves in school. Unless you look for it at the university level. And even a lot of universities, including the one that I attended, do not have an Asian studies program. So it is very hard to understand yourself. I grew up in South Brooklyn in a working class Italian and Jewish Russian neighborhood predominantly. And I really wanted to be white. I really was so weird. I didn't understand. I was pretending all the time that I knew the pop culture references, but I didn't watch any TV. My parents did not understand and did not care. All I wanted was to wear blue jeans. Like, they did not care. They didn't understand that. My junior high school I went to was predominantly Black. Most of my friends then were from the Caribbean, or their parents were from the Caribbean. And then I just really wished that I could be like them. I wish I could be Black. I wanted to grow up to be like Denise Huxtable and go to Hillman. I didn't understand. There was nothing for us to aspire to for ourselves. And so like that kind of cycling, I think, makes it difficult on the one hand. And then finally, when I came to be like, oh, like Asians are a thing, it was like briefly an obsession. And then I was so over it. I didn't want to hear about it anymore. I didn't want to participate in any kind of Asian politics thing. I didn't look for those courses in college or anything like that. I just wanted to be a person. And there is also a lot of challenge in just talking about these kinds of social, invisible, psychological effects, because there's not a lot of encouragement for a first generation, any kind of immigrant community to look into understanding ourselves. Like, you find something so that you can survive. You look for more objective kinds of trades where you will be judged quantitatively on your work. Numbers, they are hard to discriminate against. You don't go into become an English major or an artist, or, I did that, and it was kind of crazy because I didn't know anybody who made a living as a writer or an artist. And when I graduated from school, that was very clear to me. And I ended up going back to the trade of my family. I ended up back in a restaurant as a prep cook. So a lot of these things, I do think, I don't know if I'm answering the question at all, or, feel free to jump in. Also, I don't need this to be a monologue. But yeah, I think for me, the self-erasure just seems like the best way to move forward. There's no point really, it felt like, I think. And so once I started to find some things on my own, and really one of the things I really tried to do in the past few years, since we're going back to school, is like piece that together for myself. And then look for other people. Unfortunately, I've been able to find some. G knows when I first met him, we started talking. I was just pumping him for information because I'd never met another Chinese person who was my age from China who was not in finance or going to be a doctor and could actually help me understand the kind of political lineage of myself and my family and the other side of things. So I think that is, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to think about and hard to navigate. But the self-erasure, for me, I think maybe it looked a bit like that.
Is that like a common experience, like among your friends or family members?
For me?
Yeah.
I mean,
or it depends on.
I would say maybe. I mean, I don't think any of my friends any of my family, and maybe not many of my friends and I have these conversations. I think, well, amongst my family, my brother and I are the only ones who were born in the US. So we have maybe like 40 cousins. We have kind of a large family, but they are mostly trying to make a living, I think, not torture themselves about these existential issues the way we are doing right now. And I think maybe that is also part of the difficulty in initiating this dialogue in our own community. Yeah, it sometimes feels like very low priority. Like you just are, yeah.
I wonder if there's a way for other people, like to do emoji to see if like other people have experienced or discuss this self-erasure or experience it. And especially right now with the situation of you know, the attitude towards the whole virus and the backlash and mistreatment.
I think I want to open up to everyone at this point. So feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share any experience. Let's have a conversation.
Hey, I actually had a reflection on what Caroline was sharing about the self-erasure. It's interesting because over and over, I often meet African-American people who grew up in suburbs who have a very similar experience, a very parallel experience of feeling like they're navigating two worlds between whiteness and between their own cultural history and identity, and trying to understand that more while surrounded by a culture other than their own. So I thought it was a really interesting reflection.
Yeah, perhaps I can also add on that. The reason why I asked a little bit about the almost the in-betweenness, which is also what I come across from Jeff Chang's work, is that because of that urge to kind of fit in between, even though we know that this is nothing is sitting on a continuum, but then the urge to fit in, it actually makes people work so hard to adapt to, and also to find a way to earn a position on the table that eventually some of the American Chinese or even Chinese who are currently in the States, not even finding a position of being in between, but become invisible. And I think particularly during this time of coronavirus, where there's a lot of data and statistics saying that many of the high number of actually infected patients are Black, and the proportion is unusually high. So there is a lot of discussions around the very important matter of white supremacy, and also, of course, the oppression of the Black. And even until today, we continue to see this. I think that constant navigation of finding where to fit in is something that maybe tie back to Caroline's, your story on how your personal upbringing, trying to fit in your own childhood journey. I think that kind of gives us some thoughts to think about. And also, I wonder if there's any inspiration on what kind of agency within us that could help us drive kind of a slightly different future.
I have to think about this for a second. I mean, that is a very layered, I think, question. G, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's always really important to find the community and like to reach out to form a community. And I think for us who are navigating in different communities, it's a great tool trying to speak to both or several to like really bridge this misunderstanding in between, because the mainstream is never trustworthy. Like all the information we get from, or all the information, other representation we get through our education or the mainstream media, it's extremely simplified and lost the real touch of what the people are, which is really damaging. Like back to your presentation talking about this looking for authenticity within the food. It's the same thing when people are talking about this kind of issues, are looking for authenticity within the people. So when so in the video you showed, people are accusing each other, saying like, is the Black community showed up for cost effective to the Asian American community, or is the Asian Americans there during the Black Lives Matters causes, which is an extremely generalized way to talk about this kind of issues. And we, at least ourselves, should, if we're organizing a new kind of community engagement, like this should be something we talked about as well, to really see through the complexity and to see through this generalized way of categorizing people in color code, but to emphasizing this human side of the story.
Yes, I definitely agree. I think that there really isn't any shortcut to doing what we're doing, for example, right now, to be able to understand people that we don't know. And I know that for myself, one of the most important helpful things for me coming to understand myself, I had to definitely learn that from somewhere, because my family didn't have the ability to do that, since they're not American. I mean, they are now, but they are immigrants. They didn't have an understanding of the culture and of the history here, and of racism in the same way that I did. And then, I didn't have any teachers who, barely any who were not white. And only once did I have someone who looked like me teach me. That was my sophomore year in university. And so I learned really from my friends. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very diverse city. I had a lot of Black friends who invited me into their homes. I went to church with them, to graduations and birthdays. I read a lot of books from the intellectual canon of Black thought, and that was the beginning point for me. I couldn't find hardly any that had that in-between perspective at that time. But I think I was struck at some point in that journey by the reality that, and this is a difficult thing, a conversation to have, but that was not often just numbers wise even possible, but it wasn't often reciprocated. Most of my Black friends had not had any other friends who were Asian besides me, had not been to an Asian home or church or community event, didn't know the insides of that. And so obviously there are a number of reasons for that, and it's not exclusive to, we're not creating another racial binary here, but there really isn't a shortcut to that, I think, is maybe part of what you're noting. Some of these images that I didn't include, that I were part of something else, but let me find. Like these here that I had briefly touched on, one of the things that's super interesting about that is that I think I'm still very curious about and leaning into is part of the way that we try to understand each other, and in that we try to understand ourselves. I think there has been, however problematic, of a lot of obvious cultural exchanges and kind of fetishizing, fantasy co-opting behaviors between minority groups. And part of that is, I think, that same impulse that you mentioned is to try to, and I think this is a comment that Vero has here, it's like to fight against the stereotypes that are placed upon us. So Asian men, for example, are really painted as effeminate, weak, undesirable, in spite of the history of them literally using their bodies to break through the Sierra Nevada mountains to create the national railway for the explosion of American commerce, right? Them being able to put on an image to convince the outside world that you are not only those things. that you can present, in spite of your face everything the opposite. You can also present the masculine side of yourself. You can present the side of yourself that you want to be, that your face will not allow you to be, and vice versa. This very popular amongst, I think, a lot of Black culture in hip hop, Wu-Tang Clan, Kung Fu movies, this being painted as hyper masculine, wild, animalistic, uncontrolled, being able to have like something aesthetic, visual, obvious that is so opposite, to put on, to present a different side of yourself, to present a side of you that you want to be, that your skin will not allow you to be, nuanced, disciplined, powerful without being painted as aggressive. I think underneath what we see as like problematic and offensive, there is something there that has to do with this push against our perceived identity, and the struggle to kind of, you know, prove that you are not just what you are forced to represent. So I think that that's something that we have to be maybe more sensitive about when we start these conversations, because I think there's a lot of righteous anger to it. Like in, for example, this conversation that took place. But I think that there kind of polarization and politicization is, I'm not saying that we should just skip over it or anything like that, but that isn't where the whole conversation should end. Yeah, does anybody have anything to, you guys can feel free to jump in. This is an interesting kind of forum because everyone is muted, so you don't actually know what's going on when you're talking.
Please feel free to unmute yourself. Like,
Yeah.
Let's make this happen. Also, like another thing I felt is really important to always addressing, like all these problems are under the capitalism umbrella. Like it's often mixed with class struggles, and eventually it's like a power game, right? Like because you are lack of power, your lack of platforms to be presented, you lack of supporting system, then certain question yourself. So like even within the communities, it's really extremely important to claim the power back, to creating platforms, because also thinking back for like this message of American dream for immigrants, like why Americans so great, so the immigrants come, and this is the place you can find the opportunity you can make to a good life, which is a capitalism message. And in many incidents, when people ask Asian Americans whether they are Americans, many of them constantly say they are not, but they are citizens of this country. So like they see the citizenship as the approach to this question as a utilitarian way, but I think that's like one of the reason is that's coming from this alienation of what Americanness really is, and it's really important to, for me at least, from my perspective, to reclaiming what the Americanness is. It's not only or not the capitalism message, which is people are here and trying to trick each other's way and claiming spaces to push other people away, as to rejecting. I think for us who work in the community in organizing, it's important to point that out and getting back to a more human approach. It is us living here and trying to make it suitable for all of us, and creating this common grounds, creating common understandings between community members, which is cross racial lines, cross class lines, cross political differences. And we should always have this bottom line of like, this should be a habitable, kind, loving space for everyone.
Speaking of community and organizing, we're at 9 o'clock, so I just want to be conscious of people's times. And if you, it's Zoom, so we don't really, you can easily leave. So if you need to, please don't feel that you, but I did want to ask before Caroline leaves and G leaves, that speaking of community organizing, do you have any suggestions as to what to do in this moment with, we have 22 people here, so we are a force. Do you have any suggestions as to what to do now? And I'll mute myself.
So I want
Or
to.
does anyone else have suggestions?
Yeah. So okay, this is Angela speaking. So you know, my organization, People Matter. We had an article come out recently with WEBZ about our work tackling anti-Blackness in the Chinatown community in Chicago. And you know, G came to our last meeting, the Let's Talk About Anti-Chinese Sentiment during COVID-19 series. And so we actually have a phone bank coming up. So this is my plug that I responded to your call. So we have a phone bank, 2 phone banks next week. So one is Wednesday, and it's calling the governor. It's basically like phone bombing the governor's office to tell him to advocate for, to protect against violence, protect East Asians against violence and hate crimes. And then another phone bank on Friday that is protecting Black American communities in Chicago. So we're doing 2 phone banks, one for East Asian and one for Black American communities. And like, you know, this whole Black Asian dynamic is one that we are really attuned to and working on, especially with like community members who don't have like the language access, but also, you know, people from all over. So I can, you know, I'll put that in the chat group, but that's just, you know, some stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for that. I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, personally, I don't have solutions, but I think this is an attempt to kind of find our people, right? So this is a great beginning to start the conversation as we've been discussing. That's kind of the purpose of doing this. And it's been amazing to see how many people are really committed and curious and just trying to have this, understand this a little bit better. I mean, I would love to keep in touch. I think that that's super important, not to just let it die with an incident. And I think as far as our identities in creating these things, it is where we start, but I think that that definitely is not where we want to end. I think, to me, the issues of power are really immutable, and I think finding a way to create a working class solidarity across lines of race and transnational boundaries is really critical, especially at this time, what we're seeing politically around the world and in the US and in Chicago. So I know there must be a lot of you who are doing that work. If you want to stay in touch, please shoot us a message. This is something that we would love to find ways to continue and maybe support you. If you also have other plugs, please feel free to take the opportunity to do that. I think the important thing is not that we are looking for justice for all and thriving for all, and not just to get the power for ourselves. And I think that that's something for all of us in our communities when we're fighting for our own issues, that if we focus on that, that is an automatic avenue to working together. G, you wanna?
Yeah, like, you know, for the simple thing, right? Like for our education system, like even including this racial struggle into our American history teaching, and really have the present and give people the tools and to navigate the really difficult socio-economic system we are facing, especially for younger generations, is very important. On top of, like, and that is what we all can do. We all went to schools. We all know people working in schools, to reaching out as people to put this kind of education, to make this kind of education available for everyone, could be an approach.
Does anyone else have other plugs, that actions that people can do? Or thoughts?
I just wondered if there's like a reading list. This isn't really a plug, but just have some of the things, Caroline, specifically that you mentioned, of some of the essays or things that you had. I think that might be helpful if there's a shared way. I always think, for me anyway, and maybe for some other people, reading is a really helpful thing, or viewing other outside sources to kind of follow up on. So I'm like, oh, I love everything that you're saying here. Where do I read more of it? That's my kind of takeaway.
Yeah, I have kind of a little mishmash of things. Some of them articles, some of them books, and different things like that. Trisha, how can we make that available, do you think?
So we have everyone's sign up through Eventbrite, so we can post the what the comments are in the chat. We can send the recording to everyone, and we can, or you can share your reading list.
Yeah, and actually what I've been really interested in doing, if y'all are interested, I have it in a Google document, and I can just make it a shared one, and everyone also, that would be a great way for us to share resources during this time. Other materials that y'all are looking at that have to do with any of the issues that we're discussing and trying to understand better, we can make kind of a collective resource sheet in that way, and that can be a good way to start it off. That's a good idea, Kevin. Thanks.
Another thing I was thinking about is, oftentimes people come to this kind of event is who people are already thinking about this kind of issues, but there's a massive population it's difficult to reach out to. So even trying to get to their platforms and those population, not those, but trying to reach out to platforms are reaching different population is really important too.
Yes, I mean, I think that is something that if we can all keep thinking about that, because I think for me, this delineation that when I first started looking into between what Peter Kwong called the uptown and downtown Chinese and my own experience of having to navigate that transition from one group to the other, is that when you are in that situation, as a lot of this disenfranchised population is, there really isn't the time or the access to the kinds of resources that allow you to communicate and participate in activism or discussion about your own situation, even if that is you that everyone is talking about. So I think that's something that is important, not just to keep the pulse on, but will take quite a bit of effort. And if any of you are working on that, and want to share about that, I think that is a kind of intersectionality that needs to really be understood a little bit better, that of intersections of socioeconomic class.
I mean, there's many organizations are already there, but maybe without a really nuanced message. Like, even within the Asian American community, there's many people are organized around religion, like the church are very present in the community. There's a lot of mutual help kind of society. Many organizations organizing people based on where they come from, like where they come from originally in different parts of China. But many of those are, I think everyone have this needs to sharing their own experiences, to sharing their stories, and to find a supporting and loving community. But many times, because for different reasons, the message oftentimes it's hard to get a nuance into those kind of situation. Angela, could you share something? I remember during our conversation, you mentioned some of your own experience when working with the more established Asian American organization in Chinatown.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So I guess, in our last conversation, let's talk about anti-Chinese sentiment during the coronavirus. So we had a bunch of different people. Some people who were at this meeting came, like artists and different people from, Chicago, the US. But then also we had a principal, and we had like a counselor, a local Chinatown counselor and principal, and some parents. And so some people, when they started talking about like white supremacy, that was something that, we realized there were so many different audiences here. And so maybe like, the parent who was talking about like, I'm so scared, like I'm scared for my life and I don't ever want to leave my house. Like you talk about white supremacy, it's kind of like really hard. It just like goes over the head, you know, but then, you know, people here all want to address the same issue, you know, which is like healthy, safer communities. But it's just like the way we talk about it is hard. But I don't know, G, I think I was sort of talking to what Carolyn was saying, but I don't know if you were thinking of a different question.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned you worked, I don't remember the name of the organization on top of my head, before you established People Matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how your own experience and how the organizations respond to the current environment.
Well, the one thing that struck with me a lot with the previous organization that I worked at was this big lawsuit. It was sort of a fight over an elementary school that was going to be converted into a high school. So it was this elementary school that's right off the red line in Chinatown, but it's on the other side of the viaduct. So there's this sort of like barrier that the viaduct creates where, like, you know, projects or, you know, are usually on different sides of the viaduct. So there was this National Teachers Academy. It's this school that was built like, you know, kind of recently. And it used to be really level 3, which is the lowest CPS rating, but then they climbed up to level 1+. So it's one of the best schools in the nation. But then the Charlotte public school system wanted to shut it down and convert it into a high school that would serve like the neighboring communities, including Chinatown. And so Chinatown was really advocating for a school, or the conversion of the school of majority Black and low-income kids, who are also like one of the most highest performing schools in, you know, like Chicago. And so that was, you know, a really tough situation, and there's tons of articles written on it. And actually the school, the elementary school won a sort of lawsuit or an injunction, and that's like one of the first ever like cases where a school system is able to like win on claims of racial discrimination. But that was just, you know, there's just so many issues, and I don't know if we can talk about them all here, about like why was it that the communities, you know, weren't able to, or I mean, it's not like people didn't try to talk about it, and there were 3 racial equity impact like assessments that we all attended, but there's just so many different levels. And even now when they're advocating for the high school, some parents are asking like, do we even need a high school? And so it's like, who is actually pushing these agendas for things like a new high school, which is like, you know, supposed to be good for the community, but is it the parents who's pushing these agendas? Like, is it the community leaders? Like even the high schoolers, like where is their voice in here? And so I think that is on like the community leaders, that's on the schools, that's on the like other organizations that are hosting these racial equity impact assessments. And also there's so much like language barrier and so many inadequacies within the existing organizations. But not to say, I mean, but the community, like, you know, the community is like a great, like people really care. And, you know, I love the community. I'm not trying to say that the community is not, you know, a good one. But anyways, the National Teachers Academy case is something that people can look up if they're interested.
Does anyone have any more questions or comments?
On the or side of things, on the comment side of things, earlier you had asked, what are some other things we can do during a climate like this? And I think this exact conversation that talks about, although it might not have been intended, there was a lot of parallels that came up that Caroline had mentioned What G had mentioned about a lot of this being really about financial oppression were all salient points that run parallel in many different marginalized communities. And when I think about the primary communities being marginalized at a time like this, I think of the Asian community, as people have mentioned. I think of the African American community. I think of the African communities abroad. And now would be a great time to have some conversations led by groups like yours, groups that are advocating on behalf of Africans here in Chicago, in an African American led group, to do one of two things: to either talk about the collective discriminations that are happening here in the States and around the world in a very open way, or alternatively, just in regards to creating more cohesion, even having a less direct conversation about what are the shared experience, what are the histories of Asian Americans, of African Americans, of Africans here in Chicago, in a place that's a hotbed for segregation and oppression, as a more indirect way to bring these groups together and see their commonalities.
I think that's excellent. I don't know who's going to take that up, but if you want to, we have a Zoom platform, and I think Carolyn and G, and we're working on a Windows to the World exhibition, an exhibition in our windows. Maybe that could be something. We're trying to envision what we want the world to be like once we go out again. And certainly that would be, I think, something that the world needs to address and could plan for what that world would be like. But we've got 14 people left, so maybe one of you wants to take up that mantle.
I mean, currently we're working on it. And I think that, you know, when we envision things, I mean, everyone will have their different vision, and it's sort of like who is envisioning it, and I guess that's where outreach becomes a really important part of, like, you know, work in communities, and just being able to connect to people directly impacted. But yeah, I think that also the stories, you know, they require like a lot of effort to create and to curate and to, you know, fine tune the messages and get all the participants and get the equipment and all that sort of stuff in order for it to have like this sort of, and then also like the screenings, like who will be at the screenings, who are the screenings being advertised to, are the children, like our elementary school students watching it, like our seniors watching it. Like all this sort of stuff has to be thought of when we think of, like, you know, really shifting the conversation. But yeah, I mean, artists are a really big part of all of this, of shaping the narrative for sure.
And like somehow reaching out becoming relatively easier because everyone's starting to, like, you know, used to this way of like linking online. Versus before it felt really intimidating, or it's kind of like you need to go to a show, go to a meeting, you need to make the effort. But like this unfortunate, the pandemic actually opened up this window for people to easily to like sharing their own perspectives and to join to find a community online. And which resonate their own, find like a new way of organizing through this way, and also based on their day-to-day life as well. It's like not only happens online, but it's like it's sharing information, finding platforms online, but seated in different places.
I think, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think, Divinity, your point of this collective sharing and finding the community in a collective discrimination, I think is a brilliant point. And I think it was opened up in a way that was so beautifully exposed and richly detailed throughout history with Caroline's really important discussion of how we got to where we are. And it's like, it brings us to this point. And so I think we can try to figure out how to move forward, potentially using this platform or other platforms that we each, and as G and Caroline and everyone have articulated, all the different communities that we're a part of. So thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, G.
Oh, I mean, I just want to thank you for thinking about ways to outreaching. I think, you know, like a window, a message in the window is a really interesting idea, and this kind of thing don't have to be centralized. It don't have to be such a, by any means, a grand move, but like, you know, put something in your front yard, change your Facebook cover photos. Like this can all be ways to show. So, I mean, like, our bar is so low, like our reality is so toxic, and like even by simple exposure, it's really interesting. Like I haven't been active on Facebook for like 5 years. And then like this thing kind of like linked me back in, but because like the moment I thought it's like, you know, the false information is so present everywhere. And it, even like despite how much like negative feelings I towards Facebook, but like I think it's like we should use any kind of platforms to you know to claim the space, right? To claim our narrative.
And I think part of that also, the success of that will depend on all of us speaking to our own communities the way we're talking about. Because every community, no matter how oppressed, it is very easy to dismiss and dehumanize the others. And so the critique has to come from within. It is not really going to go very far for the Black community to critique the Asian community on their anti-Blackness, or for the Asian community to critique the Black community on anti-Asianness or anything like that. It is the world if we want to make those conversations. I think it's really great to see now more people bring those complicated conversations up about not just protecting our own images and following the self-preservation path, but to really think about what it means to strive for an actual reality that is one where we're doing something together. And so yeah, I agree with all of the points that are made. I think it's something that is definitely happening more, and yeah, we'll look forward
Also,
to
we all
seeing
know,
what other
like,
iterations are possible.
I think we all know the best way to approach to our own community and to find the right plug, the right strategies to talk about the issues we care about. It's never good to, like, you know, through this, I introduce you to this new idea kind of way, but, like, you know, finding the grounds people share, then through that, and how can we articulate the complexity of the world we are living in, and how can we make it a a better place, and finding the right way to reach to that point.
That's a good note. Thank you, everyone. We'll connect everyone through emails, I think.
I mean, it won't be the last one, and I'm sure. And we have everyone's emails. We will sending out our information. So we're sending out the recording of this conversation. And this is just a start of, you know, things like the problems we are facing is like so big, and the infrastructure we can rely on is very limited. So there's many works can be done, and which is also very exciting. Please feel free to start something to including people. I think it's much needed for everyone to hear about this kind of information. And thank you, Trisha, for organizing this, and thank you, Culture Center, if you are still there, or ever been there, to giving the opportunities to host this meeting. I hopefully people from the Culture Center can hear about this conversation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Caroline G, everyone.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for showing up.
Stay safe.
Take care.
Bye.